Now in Lecture 7b we go on to the last really great master within the Northern Song monumental landscape tradition, Guo Xi. And we have from him, again, one major reliable work, not only signed, as Fan Quan's and Yanwen Gui's were, but also with a title and date written on it by the artist himself. This is something new. But before showing his paintings, I'm going to talk about Guo Xi's essay on landscape painting. This is the most important, probably the most important landscape essay from the early period in China, following on the essays by Zongbing, which you remember from Lecture 3, and the Jinghao essay. This Guo Xi's was written down by his son Guo Xi from a manuscript that was left by his father, it's believed. Guo Xi served in the Imperial Academy, and Guo Xi was an official in the government. There are two good translations of this essay, one in the Bush and Schur book, pages 150 to 154, the other in the Siren, volume 2, pages 220 to 228. Siren's was made by a class of students working in Leiden under Professor Hulzeve. Siren himself didn't know Chinese, and he had other people doing his translations for him. The Bush and Schur translation was made, if I remember rightly, mainly by John Hay. Both of them are very good translations, and together they give a very clear idea of what the text is about. I'll put on the screen as I talk about this essay some quite unrelated photos of Huangshan, or the so-called Yellow Mountains in Anhui province, made on one of my climbs of that spectacular range of mountains. Guo Xi begins by talking about the purpose of painting landscape, why it was done. And as like others, he says that it serves to replace real roaming in the mountains. So, that is to say, a noble man, it's always the man in this time, might want to roam, to climb mountains, and enjoy the benefits, the spiritual benefits of being in the mountains. But in fact, he's prevented from doing that by his duties to his ruler and his family and so on. He's forced to stay in the cities or in human society. And then the painting, that is to say, then can substitute by giving him this experience. The passage in question goes like this. Here it goes. But, then, he writes, that is Guo Xi reporting on what his father wrote. Okay, but are the longing for forests and streams and the companionship of mists and vapors then to be experienced only in dreams and denied to the waking senses? It is now possible for subtle hands, that is the hands of the painter, to reproduce them in all their rich splendor. Without leaving your room, you may sit to your heart's content among streams and valleys. The voices of apes and the calls of birds will fall on your ears faintly. The glow of the mountain and the color of the waters will dazzle your eyes glitteringly. Could this fail to quicken your interest and thoroughly capture your heart? This is the ultimate meaning behind the honor which the world accords to landscape painting. Okay, enough of that. Now this obviously is another expression of what I started out by calling the primary concept of painting, of expression in painting, that is, which goes back to the Han Dynasty. You remember in the Han, people would gaze at the portraits of virtuous ministers painted on the walls and be inspired to emulate them as if they were seeing the real person. Or they would look at a painting of the landscape in summer and feel hot, or at a winter landscape and feel cold. And you remember the developments of that idea in later times. That is, the painting substitute somehow for the real scenery. It's another expression of that, in other words. Okay, then Guo Xi, next please. The next, Guo Xi talks about the importance of looking at the painting from a distance. Some aspects of nature are also best seen from a distance, rather than close up. He writes about landscape paintings that are fit to contemplate, to gaze at, some that are fit to ramble through, as in imagination, of course, and some fit to live in, and the last are the finest. He writes about what we call local schools, saying the students from Shandong, that is in the northeast, study Licheng, Those from Shanxi in the northwest study Fan Quan. So great men and great scholars don't stick to a single school, is his point. The next. He writes about the necessity of the artist having a clear conception in his mind, of concentrating on the essential nature of the thing represented. Guo Xi, his son, breaks in here and tells about his father's method of working, which is quite interesting, but not to the point for us. Okay, then, next please. He talks about the different aspects of scenery in different seasons, times of day, weather conditions, interest in light and shade. This all, of course, reflects the growing ability of the Chinese landscapist, or the Chinese painter generally, to capture these things in painting, which we have traced as we went along. He gives technical advice on the use of figures, roads, buildings, to lead the viewer's eyes through the composition. You guide the way the viewer is going to see your painting by inserting these. Okay. He writes about the main mountain versus the subordinate mountains, and how the pine tree stands out among trees, the great tree and the lesser trees. This is, of course, parallel to the social order, and that's his point. The superior man versus the small men who serve him. Next, please. He writes about the effects of seasons, the moods associated with the different seasons. Winter mountains are covered by storm clouds, and the people who see them are depressed, and so on. Contemplation of such pictures, he writes, evokes in men the corresponding ideas or feelings. Quote, it is as if one were really among the mountains. Such is the idea beyond the depicted scenery. End quote. These are, of course, refinements of this basic idea that the painting serves for the real scenery when you can't go there. He goes on to give advice on the different aspects of mountains and water. Water courses are the arteries of the mountain. Grass and trees are its hair. Mist and clouds give them an air of beauty or charm, or like the breath of the mountains. Rocks form its bones. Well, this is a kind of a form of recognizing this concept of the world as a great organism, which I've been talking about. This Neo-Confucian, Taoist, whatever you want to see it. Anyway, in the translation of this into painting, the next, he goes on to give advice on the three distances, that is, three ways of achieving effects of distance in painting. High distance, deep distance, anyway, never mind, that's too complicated for us. He writes about the use of poems as themes for painting, and mentions poetic lines and so on that are particularly suitable. Now, this is the first appearance for us of what becomes an important new criterion for judgment in painting, as we'll see. That is to say, judging whether a painting has a poetic content, whether it expresses a poetic idea, whether it has the same kind of sensibility as a poem. This becomes very important in the school of amateur painting, which we'll be looking at later. And eventually this will take over and push out other kinds of expression in painting, as we'll see. Okay, then next, please. Guo Xi writes about how the artist should travel to see famous mountains. And he says, quote, when I have stored up impressions of them in my mind, then, with the eye unconscious of the silk and the hand unconscious of brush and ink, marvelous, mysterious, boundless becomes that picture of mine, end quote. This is another expression of another idea that I've been mentioning, that is to say, the artist has to create as nature does, without purpose, unconsciously, and then what the artist paints will look natural, as a rock in nature looks natural by definition. Next, please. Finally, Guo Xi criticizes some modern painters, he calls them, who simply wave the brush and splash the ink. Well, it's hard to say what he means by this. It may be, but probably it's a matter of the the rise of the amateur artists who are claiming stature over professional artists eventually. This was coming into being in his time, and eventually was to as I've said many times, to eventually to take over. And as I'll speak of in a later time, by the early 12th century, the Emperor Huizong was so much against the paintings of Guo Xi himself that he didn't really value them and gave them away. Okay, I should add here that in my book, The Three Alternative Histories of Chinese Painting, in the chapter on meanings and functions in Chinese landscape painting, I discuss a mention by the son Guo Xi of a commission that his father received, and from whom he received the commission, a high nobleman, what the commission was, and how the artist embodied this idea in his painting, and how pleased the patron was when he saw the painting, received the painting. Okay, this is the importance of audience. This is a pretty big subject. Audience or patronage, pretty big subject in recent studies. I mean, I and my students spent a lot of time on it, but it's not. I'm not trying to do it in these lectures. But I should say simply that the idea of the untrammeled artist, the artist free to paint whatever he chooses, arises with this rise of the amateur artist. But even with them, it's largely a myth, as always. That is, until very recent times, certainly, the artist almost always had a good reason other than some inner urge for painting what he does. I quote Michael Baxendale in my discussion of this in the Three Alternative Histories book, pointing out the idea of the artist who paints a picture and then looks around for somebody to buy it is a very modern one. Well, now we go on to look at Guo Xi's painting. We have one that's generally recognized as genuine, a great masterwork. All right, now that we've considered some of the essay by Guo Xi and have some ideas of what he thought about landscape painting, now we'll see his great work, which is one of the grand masterpieces of Chinese painting, as I've said. And I showed it in the first lecture with that. And this is his painting titled Early Spring. We know the title of it because he's written it on it. So now for the first time we have a painting that is not only signed by the artist, not only includes the date, cyclical date of course, corresponding to 1072, but also gives us the title of the painting. So the artist is writing more on the paintings than he used to. The first we saw were simple signatures, Yunwen Gui and Fan Quan. A painting we'll see later when we talk about bird and flower painting by an artist named Cui Bo we'll see to be dated to 1061 with a date on it, and a signature and date. And now we have also a title. Okay, so here's Guo Xi's great painting, the Early Spring. Well, it's a painting that's so familiar, that's reproduced everywhere, that one talks about so much that one is tempted to slip into cliche observations, but then one has to remember that they aren't cliches at all, especially for the younger generations will make up, I hope, some large part of the listeners, viewers for this series. There's still important truths that have to be said. One of the important things about Guo Xi, Dick Barnhart, in his brief passage on this painting in the 3,000 Years book, makes the important point that as a court artist, Guo Xi worked for an imperial patron, the Emperor Shenzong, who reigned 1068 to 1085, who was a broadly cultivated man and ruled over a stable realm. So he was working for a stable and enlightened patron. Okay, now the composition, to start with that, as you see, it preserves much of the model of Fan Quan and so on, in the sense that it's tripartite, that is three-part. You have a main movement up the center to the highest peak, which is in the center. You have separate landscape masses, somewhat smaller at the two sides. And also, the other way, you have a section at the lower part, down here where the big land mass is with pine trees on top of it, and secular figures, or figures, low-life figures at the two sides. Then you have a middle ground with a massive twisting mass in the center here, and others at the sides. And then that takes you up to where the temple is, we'll see that. And then above that you have the peak again. So it's the same 1, 2, 3 upward movement, and the same somewhat similar composition. On the other hand, in other ways, it's profoundly different from either Fan Quan or Yan Wen Gui, where they were relatively stable visions of the world. This is a grand vision of the world in flux, going through a process of change. All the landscape masses, as you see, are undercut or overhanging, and the whole thing seems to have the inner energy of some vast organism, more than what we think of as inert earth landscape masses. The earth masses are shaded, we'll see that close up later, for the effect of rotundity, not so much texture strokes as overlaid loose brush strokes that make them appear earthy rather than rocky. Li Cheng was said to have painted rocks like clouds, they meant earth masses. And Guo Xi obviously is still painting, in a sense, rocks like clouds. So there's a strong sense of light and shadow throughout the picture, although there's no consistent light source, as there isn't ever in Chinese painting. The painting, as I say, has the same basic unifying narrative that we've seen in others, going back to painting attributed to Guangtung and the Five Dynasties. That is, from a daily life level at the base of the painting, making one's way up, eventually seeing a Buddhist temple, which we'll come to. It's hidden here, not so conspicuous as usual. And then above that, the peak. Well, there is a Buddhist temple also over here in the center right. We'll look at that too. Well, okay, we'll look at the details now and talk about that. Now let's go on. Here at the sections, I say, in the center right, very important. First of all, we can see already the sheer refinement of execution of the painting. It's extraordinary in this way. It's amazing. The drawing of the trees, the drawing of the rocks, everything in it is done in brushwork that you aren't really conscious of. It is so fine, so free of mannerism, so sort of natural in a sense. I'll talk about that too. Okay, here we have a hollow, misty hollow in the mountains, and a Buddhist temple set in it, set behind trees. A row of trees across the middle ground here, tall pine trees, leafy trees, bare trees in the upper left. And we have a stream or river pouring down from one pool to another, quite beautifully painted. And then these great ovoid masses of earth surrounding it, making up the landscape proper. Up here in the upper right, something we haven't seen before in hanging scroll paintings, which is a kind of on a kind of ledge here behind the two crossed pine trees, is a tingzi, or pavilion, kiosk, whatever you want to translate it. Anyway, a little building where people can sit. Actually, you see two bucket seats inside, I think, and sit and gaze out over the landscape. Now, this is not a landscape that's made to be gazed at like some we've already seen and more we'll see later in this lecture. Not at all. This is still very much the landscape, complete in itself, but you can move through, wander through, find your way through, and so on, live in, so to speak, as Guo Xi says. On the other hand, the placement of this little pavilion suggests the possibility, at least, of someone sitting there and gazing out over the landscape. Okay, we'll come back to this section later. Let's start at the bottom now and make our way up. Down here at the bottom of the picture, on the left side of this large mass with surmounted by trees, is one of the two little passages of daily life or low life, whatever, living. On the other side, which I don't have a detail of, we see fishermen. Here is a family that is coming back from some trip, I guess, or a journey. At any rate, a boat moored, a man carrying luggage over his shoulders, a woman, a child on her shoulder, another child walking beside her. And then here at the lower right, we see there was something of their house, a simple fence, a thatched roof. Okay, and this, by the way, the outlines, as you see, have to be quite thick, heavy, in order to hold their own, to fulfill their function within a hanging scroll. And they're kind of fluctuating in width, and the landscape masses you see already are not textured exactly, but treated with some sense of light and shadow by more or less application of ink. Okay, moving upward. Now I don't have slides of the middle section, but now we move up to the upper middle section. And here in this wonderful slide of a view through a ravine in the mountain, between the mountain masses, we see a traveler with a broad hat and his servant with his luggage as usual, and another servant walking ahead, luggage over his shoulder, over a log bridge. And then up above that, this really wonderful passage of mist in the trees, mist hiding or almost hiding the tops of bare trees. Well, here again we see what I spoke of as the extraordinary refinement of execution of this painting, a master artist. And you don't see anything that is kind of ready-made, repetitive, learned, artificial, and so on. Next slide. Up we go. One more up. A little bit further up. Again, looking down into a kind of hollow behind a landmass, as if the people are making their way up through some kind of ravine with an overhanging mass. And again, trees with fog in them, and a bare tree in the foreground. And more fog up above, atmosphere throughout the painting. Well, I remember very well, I used to spend a lot of time in Marin County, across the bay from Berkeley, north of San Francisco, across the bridge and up on the coast. And the beaches there are wonderful, and there are heavy fogs there often. And I remember often seeing scenes there that reminded me of this, that is, mist in the trees and so forth. Well, once you really find your way into this painting and spend time with it, it becomes part of your life, I think. At least it certainly has with mine. I think with other people too. Then as we make our way further up, we see eventually in this ravine of not the top of the painting, but at the bottom of the main peak, so to speak, the roofs of temples. And this is the goal toward which some, at least, of the travelers making their way up the paths are moving. Here again, a wonderful use of atmospheric perspective, obviously. Dark things close up, lighter behind, still lighter, and so on, creating a wonderful sense of space and distance. And the treatment of trees, at the middle right, a pair of pine trees drawn relatively dark, and then almost repeated in two of them further up and to the left, which takes you back into that space. So the painting then has the pattern that we've seen in a number of hand scrolls already from the painting attributed to Guangdong and the Five Dynasties, in which people are making their way up from an area where you might have an inn or people living, ordinary people who live in the landscape, making their way up toward a temple, which represents some kind of spiritual goal, presumably. And then above that, an inaccessible peak, no way of climbing, no paths, no anything, just pure nature, representing some kind of spiritual hierarchy, I would assume. Now, the strange thing is that I have to say, I would assume, because there's no writing that I know of in Chinese that describes this form or this pattern, nor in writings of the time or later writings. And this is strange. It's also true that, foreign writers have somehow failed to note this constant pattern or common pattern and written about it. Well, the only thing I can say about that is that it bears out an observation I used to make often, which is that many of the most interesting and important features in Chinese painting are not represented or noted or treated adequately in the literature. It's a strange phenomenon, but It is simply true. The literature is voluminous, it's great, and yet there's many, many things that one sees in the paintings that is not noted there, not discussed there. Okay, the reason I always gave is fairly simple, and that is what goes on in the mind of painters when they are at work, or when they are using what they learned from the past and transmit to later painters. This is very different from what goes on in the mind of someone writing a theoretical or a critical essay. The two, which are often linked more than they should be, are actually quite separate worlds, I think, with only a tenuous and problematic relationship between them. Anyway, to get back to the painting, let's go on now. Okay, here's going back to that section at the center right. I have an important observation to make about it that, again, has not been generally seen. I myself didn't notice it until we made a big transparency of this painting for my scarab book, and I was making slides from it and noticed a strange passage. Okay, here this big ovoid mass topped, surmounted by crossed pine trees, and behind it this tingsa for viewing. Okay, now down below that and to the right, you see what the artist, when he sketched out the whole composition, as artists do, they sketch it out in charcoal or somehow simply, and then they gradually build it up. The artist must have intended this as a earth slope coming down with trees growing out from it. I mean, you have the next slide. Here, I made this slide just to make this point. If you black out that part, it seems pretty clear, with the trees, they say, growing out from it, that the original intention was to have a slope of earth there. Now, what actually happened? The artist changed his mind, and somewhere, at the last minute, so to speak, made a very awkward change in which this ovoid mass is treated, becomes a kind of overhanging mass, and a space is opened up beneath it. And you look down there at eroded banks of earth, and trees are growing out in the other direction to the right, and the trees that should be growing out of the earth bank instead have to sort of turn around and grow back into the other thing. And it's all very awkward, as you see. It's only so when you notice it. Very few people, nobody that I know of, has ever really noticed this in the painting as a whole. But why did the artist do this? Well, I have a pretty clear idea of why he must have done it, and that is that that within the whole composition in which everything is undercut, as I say, and unstable, and not stable and solid. This passage at the middle right, if he had continued his original plan and made this into a slope of earth, would have been too substantial, too solid, too filled. And in order to keep up this undercut character of so much of the painting and to continue it into this passage, he was forced to make, or decided to make, this very awkward last-minute change. Okay, it tells us something about the nature of the painting and the painter, I think, that's really pretty interesting. Okay, so in presenting this special, very, very special version of the world, very different from that of Fan Quan and Yan Gui, not representing a stable, lasting world of solid, slow-changing geology as they do, rather a world in which erosion and transformation is taking place. The painter presents a very different vision to us. Okay, I could spend another hour showing landscapes in the Guo Xi manner by his followers, some of them old and fine. The school of landscape that was founded by Li Cheng and continued, transformed that is, by Guo Xi in the northeast of China, Shandong and so on, is established as a local school there. More than that, however, it becomes one of the major schools of landscape in later times, and painters in Yuan and Ming could paint what they call Li Guo style landscapes. Li Guo meaning Li Cheng Guo Xi. Okay, now I'll show a few, however, of the paintings attributed to Guo Xi and discuss them. One of the contenders, next please. One of the strong contenders for earliness is this picture, Snowy River Gorge, which is in the Shanghai Museum. A tall, narrow picture, as you see, featuring flatter forms, more emptiness in the silhouette, not so much modeling, not so much rotundity in the landscape forms. Probably this is a section of a screen. I've mentioned before that when you have a tall composition like this, tall, narrow, and especially when it doesn't seem complete, this one doesn't have any sign of human habitation, no paths, no people, no anything. So it's probably one panel of a large composition made up of however many panels, 6 or something. And it's a surviving piece from that. Now how old it is is another question. Here's a detail from it. As I say, the forms are more silhouetted, less substantial than in the real Guo Xi. It's an early work, I think. I doubt that it's a real work by Guo Xi, but I can't be absolutely sure. Anyway, it's an early work to be taken seriously. Now, an impressive survivor from what must have been an important composition. Next, please. Here is another big painting that is in the Palace Museum. It was in the Chinese Art Treasures exhibition, number 47 there, titled Clearing After Snow in the Min Mountains. Okay, there are lots and lots of paintings that take up this style with the so-called rocks-like clouds, with the bare trees, with the bleakness, and with all the instability and internal movement of Guo Xi style. This is a composition, as you see, in the same mode as a painting we saw ascribed to Jing Hao, which is asymmetrical, with a long recession on one side leading up to distant hills. And on the other side, the left, we climb up a series of landscape masses to the highest peak. And this may be somewhat later than Guo Xi. The size of the pine trees on the lower right, which make a much easier entrance than we were used to in early landscape, somehow suggest a slightly later date. However, I have a couple details of it here. Here's a detail of that lower right, 2 travelers on mules going through this bleak, cold landscape. Quite a fine painting, and the trees are well drawn, but the rocks are done a little more hastily, slapdash, one could almost say. And the whole picture, here another detail, the whole picture has a kind of tumultuous, active sense that it goes beyond the Guo Xi. It doesn't have the organic unity of the Guo Xi at all. So this is a good follower, able to do, for instance, things like the way the waterfall pours down here at the left from one hollow into another. Quite fine in its way, a schoolwork. And there's quite a number of these, really, from various periods. It becomes an extremely important school of landscape. Now, let's see here what. This, by contrast, next please, this is a painting titled Village Among Lofty Mountains, which is not a Song painting at all. This is a Ming painting, maybe 15th century or so. It's very much like an artist named Li Tsai, and perhaps he painted it, an artist who worked in the academy. At any rate, this is in Seren's book, plate 176, and it's reproduced in other places as if it were an important Guo Xi style work, or even a Guo Xi. I believe this is the painting that represented Guo Xi in the 1935-36 British London exhibition. I've spoken of that before, and I will again sometime. I think the Chinese deliberately sent bad early paintings to the exhibition for whichever reason, and it really set back the study of Chinese painting somewhat. At any rate, this is very much a Ming painting with things happening all over, lots of detail, no big unity, no spatial unity, not much space really, but just much more on the surface. And I won't talk about the painting. It's clearly Ming, and things are happening all over in it, people traveling and people living, and the little kiosk here for gazing, all the rest of it, and a Buddhist temple up on the right. Well, behind it, of course, way behind it is the Guo Xi, but terribly reworked for the Ming period. Enough of that. Okay. Now we look at 2 hand scrolls, which are much more important, older, more important, and to be taken much more seriously. This one, here's the first section of the first one in the Freer Gallery of Art, and it's titled Autumn in the River Valley. I have a section of this in the Skira book. Max Lohr reproduces Seren and so on, very famous. When I published it in the Skira book, I accepted it as probably by the same artist as the early spring picture. I would not do that now. I'm convinced that it's a fine old painting, but not as early as that. Probably a generation or so later. One Chinese scholar tried to attribute it to an artist named Wang Shun, whom we'll talk about in the next lecture, who was a kind of courtier, a person of high rank. But no, he didn't paint it. He couldn't paint this. It's by some good Guo Xi follower of, let's say, a generation or so later. The forms in the paintings you see are softened. It has much less of the compelling realism and naturalism and so on of a real landscape. The foreground is occupied by tall trees, leafy trees, bare trees. We'll see them as we go along. And a path goes along the foreground. You see people here in the lower right hurrying along, men with staffs, and at the lower left, people men on a donkey and so on. The usual travelers through the landscape. And this long vista over a valley, a little bit like the painting attributed to Xu Daoning in the Nelson Gallery, although not of that quality, not of that age. And the next, please. Here, in the next section, a fine example of atmospheric perspective, setting sharply drawn trees and rocks or earth masses in the foreground against a distant passage with a tree, groves of trees, and a gate leading out into who knows where anyway. Okay, I used to use this as a fine example of atmospheric perspective and the way it was used. And otherwise we see tall cliffs, some of them pushing up above the top of the painting, and eroded earth banks and so on, all the Guo Xi materials. Okay, here's the detail of that, showing how very well the trees are drawn. I can understand why I was so taken with it back then. It is a fine painting, and an early painting, and it's not a painting that's ridden with later mannerisms like so many others. The trees are finely drawn, the rocks or earth masses are finely drawn, and so on. And this passage, as I say, looking into the distance, is quite a good example of atmospheric perspective. Next, please. Well, as we go on, this is the third section of the painting. We see in the lower right here a traveler, making a somewhat larger figure, making his way along the path, accompanied by his servant with luggage, as usual, carrying a staff. And then he's about to arrive at an inn or restaurant, anyway, or hostel, which has the usual flag projecting from it, identifying it as an inn, where he can stop and have something to eat and drink and so on. Maybe stop over if he needs to. And the foreground plane, as I say, is marked with these tall trees, leafy trees, pine trees. This is a device that we saw all the way back to the Nelson Gallery sarcophagus of the 6th century, when there were tall trees rising from the very bottom of the composition and marking the foreground plane in order to open space behind it. And here the further limit of that space is marked by the rising cliffs, misty. So you have, again, sort of space cells within which the artist can set his figures and may have his movement. Now, as you move into the further part of this section, on the left, first of all, you see in the distance, or middle distance, a temple roofs, drawn as seen through the fog, atmospherically faded in sharpness and depth or darkness. And then down below here in the foreground, behind the rocks, you see one of our Tingza kiosk or pavilion, whatever, which is meant as a place where someone will stop and look. So here, not only the same little viewing Tingza as in the hanging scroll, but as we'll see, the rest of the landscape is treated as what the viewer sees when he sits there. Okay, the next, please. So now, the next slide, here in the lower right, you see a little bit of that tingza, and then you see another pair of crossed pines, a motif that the artist probably took from the real Guo Xi or learned from Guo Xi. And then you see a vista moving out across the eroded plains of this northeast China, and with very little to see on it, actually. A few outcroppings of earth or rock, a few bits of vegetation, distant hills, but mainly just something that is to look at. It's not by any means something that invites you to explore it. So here we have the landscape intended to be looked at. All these mottled, as if washed out marks on the scroll. I think the Freer Gallery has been remounted since this has happened. But anyway, it shouldn't be as bad as that. And here, the very end of the scroll, and even more, it sort of goes off into the distance with less and less to attract your eye, and just about nothing, in fact, just more and more distant hills and bits of foliage. Seals of former owners here at the lower left and the upper part. Okay, well, this is then what I spoke about before as a scene that is not meant to be entered and explored, but rather something to be gazed at from a fixed vantage point, represented by the tingza. Well, a great change is going on. We saw it already in the scroll attributed to Xu Daoning in the Yurin Khan in Kyoto, in which there were two figures at the far end gazing out over the scenery. And scenery is the right word for this, and it's a word one would never use of the real Guo Xi, the hanging scroll, the early spring, which is certainly not meant to be viewed by anyone in the picture, cannot be. It is meant to be explored. It's a whole world, etc., etc. Now, okay, having made that point, let me go on to another hand scroll. This one is former Crawford collection, now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, attributed to Guo Xi, and titled Lowlands with Trees. Someone recently, I've been told, has done a study of this, maybe published, I don't know, intended to establish its authenticity as a genuine work of Guo Xi. Well, I admire the painting, which I've seen many times since the days when we were compiling the Crawford catalog back in 1960 to 61, and saw it for the first time. But I think it's, again, a little later than Guo Xi, like the Freer scroll, and somewhat different from the real Guo Xi, partaking more of this new mode of landscape I'll talk about. So let me say why. Okay, here we're seeing actually the end of the scroll. We're going at it the wrong way, but I want to do it this way. One would roll it from right to left. Here we're seeing the left end first, which is not right. But okay, let me do it for my own purposes. We see two people, old men, bent over, walking with staffs, accompanied by servants, making their way across a bridge and along a path toward a rise in the terrain, which is topped by a pavilion, a place where people will meet, and this is bigger than the usual little tingza. It has a second story, as you see. A place where people will meet and maybe sit and drink wine and talk and view scrolls, maybe. So that was viewing paintings. Here, below the trees, a little bit to the left of the pavilion, are two servants carrying what seem to be hanging scrolls, wrapped probably. And one can imagine, in other words, a gathering of old friends in this pavilion, and they will drink, talk of old times, look at paintings together, and gaze out at the scenery. Okay, now let's look at the landscape itself. Look at the earth masses down here in the lower right. Now, they are in a kind of Guo Xi style, all right, except that if you start trying to figure out what is solid and what is space, it doesn't work. I mean, the nearest one is obviously solid and modeled and so on. The next one is outlined and then treated as if it were space, so there's no modeling. And then the next one to that is more solid and so forth. In other words, it has been sort of sketched out and then not completely filled in the way that Guo Xi would do it. I don't mean this is like the change of plan version episode in the middle right of the Guo Xi. It's not as major as that. It's just, as I say, someone who isn't quite filling it in neatly. Here, the next slide, please. Yeah, here we see closer up the old men, one of them turning back to look at the other, approaching the pavilion, the two servants carrying one a box, maybe it's things to eat, I don't know. The other may have scrolls over his, maybe he's carrying a chin for somebody to play the zither. Now, look at the trees also. They're quite fine, and at the same time, the nearest, the big tree here at the far right now, and the leafy tree behind it, this sudden lightening of the tone from the one tree to the next is something that, for me, belongs more in a slightly later time. Next slides, please. Now, here is the whole thing up closer. The trees are interestingly drawn. They're not mannered, not repetitive, and so on. And yet, as I say, this very sudden fine line to pale wash is something that I associate more with later in the Song. So, and I think it's somewhat later than Guo Xi, but fine painting. Here, a black and white detail of an upright detail. And you can see better this feature in the trees. You can also see down below here what I take to be not sort of following up one's original sketches in the masses, in the little rocks or masses along the pathway. Okay, now then, next please. Now we see what is really the beginning of the scroll, should be the right side, the right half of the scroll. And this, in fact, is the landscape which the people are supposed to look at as they sit in the Tingzi and look out and gaze out. And again, it's a landscape that is absolutely without any possibility of traversing. You do see a couple figures up here making the upper middle left, making their way along, but certainly no viewer is encouraged to move into it or to think of occupying it or whatever. Two fishermen down below. So it's a fine painting, but it's another one that has this character of providing the landscape, much of the landscape, as a scene for viewing rather than a more or less complete world. Okay, so then both the Freer and the Crawford scrolls have as their theme this matter of people gazing at the landscape or gathering to do so. And the pictures are composed as the Yunnan Kan Shu Dan Ning was composed to encourage that kind of reading. Landscape that cannot be traversed, landscape for gazing only. This is a very different kind of painting than the real Guo Xi, I think. Okay, now let's go ahead. Another painting ascribed to Guo Xi, this one in the Palace Museum in Beijing, titled Eroded Rocks on a Plain. A big horizontal picture with trees in the center and of a strange bare tree. Well, according to my Index of Early Chinese Painters and Paintings, is signed and dated 1078. I list it there as probably a schoolwork of the Yuan dynasty, and that still seems somewhat right to me. The handling of the rocks or earth masses is not so much like Guo Xi. That is heavy contours and not much interior modeling at all. The handling of the trees. Look at the very center tree, this strange old bare tree that twists around in a really bizarre way and twists around and ends in a hook up at the top. Look at the old bare tree at the right. Similarly, more bizarre, more strange and weird even than old trees in proper Guo Xi painting or early Guo Xi style paintings. And the leafy trees in the left here are more repetitive and flat than they should be in real Guo Xi. Next, please. Here, a passage to the right with water pouring down and so on. And you can see the difference. A little more calligraphic brushstrokes on the rocks, a little more prominence to the moving brushstroke, and not such careful modeling or shaping of the forms as in the real Guo Xi. And next, please. Yeah, here a close-up of the foreground rocks. Well, I think it's a good painting of maybe Yuan Dynasty date by some good Guo Xi follower, and shouldn't be taken as the, so to speak, real thing. Okay, and here next, please. Oh yeah, the last slide. If you look at this sort of small bare tree, you can see how much repetitiveness there is in the curves of the twigs and the hanging vines and so on. Okay, a good, interesting painting, not a real Guo Xi. Now we'll come to another hand scroll. Quite interesting, really. This is one that's in the Toledo Museum of Art. Not many major Chinese paintings there, but this is one. Title simply Snowy Hills, a fine schoolwork, maybe Yuan Dynasty again, but more distinctly in a Yuan style. And I think a very interesting and valuable Yuan Dynasty example of the Guo Xi style. Here at the beginning of the scroll, we have a long vista to distant hills and so on. Well, you can see already that it's quite different from the real Guo Xi. More variety of trees and more, well, mannered. Let's come out and say it. Yes, mannered in the forms the landscape takes and the proliferation of detail and so on. The next, please. Here, toward the further on, a passage in which you see the landscape forms rising to the top of the scroll and so on. And the usual houses with people and travelers and all the rest of it. So this is some interesting, I don't know who, but if you were to read, for instance, in my book, Hills Beyond a River, was on painting of the Yuan Dynasty, you'll find a number of Guo Xi followers there who paint landscapes that are somehow related to this. But look at this form in the upper right here. It looks almost like a human hand or something, like knuckles. Okay, it's interesting. It's expressionist, you might almost say. Now, I have an interesting memory about this picture. When I was giving my course in early Chinese painting at UC Berkeley, in one of the last performances of it, I had two extraordinary young scholars in my class. Western art people were required to take one Asian art course, and two of them took mine. One was Joseph Kerner. I've mentioned before. He went on to be a Harvard professor and write a book on Dürer and become a really noted scholar. Well, he already was. And he even wrote a term paper for a bronze course of mine and proceeded to publish it. That was Joseph. He's a great guy. He and my daughter were close for a while, but then they both went separate ways. At any rate, Joseph looked at this and said, my God, Danube School. Well, okay, what do you mean? Danube School is a school of painting in Europe, which is almost the beginning of landscape as a separate genre in European painting. You have landscape backgrounds in Renaissance painting and so on, but the Danube School does indeed have scenes that resemble this in some ways. And I took the trouble to pull out slides and look at a number of paintings by the artists of that school. And indeed, it does appear to me quite likely that they somehow knew about the Guo Xi style paintings of this kind, which were conveyed to Europe maybe in designs on furniture or screens or who knows what. But I've become a real diffusionist in my late life, and that is, I believe in the idea of styles and motifs and so on, transported long distances and taking root in the minds of artists at the faraway place and somehow coming out in their works. Okay, I think something like that may have happened here, but I leave that open for somebody else to work on. Joseph never proceeded with it, and I didn't, and so on. So let me just insert here, for the benefit of anybody who's interested in following this up, the Danube School was active in the early 16th century and included such noted artists as Albrecht Altdorfer and Wolf Huber. I used to have a series of slide comparisons ready to show what I believe to be the derivation of pictures by Danube School masters from some kind of Chinese landscape images that they came to know about, which, as I say, they may have come to Europe in the form of screens or pictures on furniture or imported craft objects of some kind. Here is one of the comparisons I used to use. The painting, which we've seen, attributed to Li Cheng, but really by some Li Guo school artist of the 12th century or so, and a drawing by Wolf Huber. Comparisons of this kind are easy to make and easy to dismiss as without significance, but if you put together enough of them, they can make you recognize a real derivation of the kind I think we have here. I'll take up the whole question of diffusionism, that is to say, the transmission of styles and motifs in art over great distances from one area and one artistic culture to another, by routes that are sometimes not easy to define or to identify. I'll do this in one of the postludes to the series. Now back to the Guo Xi followers. At any rate, here's the detail of it. A fine painting in a Yuan dynasty Guo Xi style, which deserves attention as that, and as I say, is maybe part of the beginnings of landscape in Europe. Okay, next please. This is the place to bring back a painting which I showed briefly for a short time in the previous lecture, and then said that since it didn't belong there, in my opinion, I would bring it back and show it more completely later. That was in lecture 6, where I was talking about Li Cheng. It's a painting attributed to Li Cheng, and it's in the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City. One of the purchases, and a very smart, brilliant purchase by Lawrence Sickman. I think it's a wonderful painting. I yield to nobody in my admiration for it. But I put it later than some people do. Instead of the time of Li Cheng, where I think it really doesn't belong, I put it more up into the 11th century. Fan Quan to Guo Xi, some elements of both, maybe around contemporary with Guo Xi or so. Okay, a fine painting, ink and light colors on silk, and let's now see some of the details and see why. I'm looking at it the opposite way this time, more from top to bottom instead of bottom to top. Now here in the upper left, you see you can see how the contours are drawn, how the texturing is done with something like the raindrop texture strokes that Fan Quan used and Yan Wengui used. It's more like that than anything 10th century. The outlining, the contours are also more like that. The vegetation on top of the form reminds one a bit of Fan Quan and so on. Next, please. Down in the center, this quite wonderful passage of architecture seen through bare trees. It's a Buddhist temple or monastery of the kind we usually find in these paintings, but drawn with more care and so on than usual. And as I say, seen through a screen of bare trees. Quite fine. It's a painting quite brilliant in its way and quite unusual, but I think maybe contemporary with Guo Xi. Getting up closer to the trees, you see that the movement of the brush, these little hooked strokes and with little thickening at the end sometimes, are probably more calligraphic than you are going to find in 10th century painting, I think. I'm not saying it's mannered or that it's repetitious or anything like that, but it's a little, anyway, not exactly like the extreme naturalism that is aimed at least in 10th century painting. Quite sudden, again, change from foreground to distance, the setting the dark trees against the lighter. The next, please. Here, the waterfall and the bare trees set against the waterfall. The painting is full of drama and full of really quite, as I say, brilliant juxtapositions of things in it. But here again, you see something that reminds you probably more of the Fan Quan waterfall and, as I say, the raindrop sun and so on than anything in the 10th century. The next, please. Down below, the waterfall pouring down into a pool at the bottom. Waterfalls in Chinese paintings tend to be a little more hard, a little less convincing than the rest of the painting. It's not something that they are marvelously good at. Okay, but here you can see also, again, this close-up, this rather Fan Quan, Yan Wengui-like outlining and so on. But it's later in their time, and I think it belongs maybe around the time of Guo Xi. Next, please. Down at the bottom, we see the low-life passage with people in an inn, the usual flag, sitting around eating, with people of sort of common character as seen in their faces and their hats and their postures and so on, and the place they are occupying. Okay, that's common. We have something like it in various paintings. Okay, next, please. Here's the lower left corner, and you see, interestingly, a traveler on a donkey, in this case, entering the painting with his two servants, one of them carrying luggage, and then across the water, a man leaning over the balcony, or out of the balustrade, or over the railing of a house, gazing across as though he's going to somehow establish contact with this traveler. Interesting little human interest details. And here, let's see. Oh, here's the last slide. Is just a wonderful slide of the central portion. It is, as I say, a terrific painting. The painting of the waterfall on the upper right is wonderful. And the setting of the bare trees below that against the mist and so on. It's a wonderful painting. It was owned actually by a collector dealer in Tokyo named Piacentini, Michelangelo Piacentini. He was an Italian who was interned in Japan during the war, and after he was freed, he stayed on as a kind of dealer collector, working actually in one of the department stores on exhibitions. Well, I knew him slightly, and Sickman anyway bought this painting from him. The attribution to Li Cheng may be no earlier than Piacentini. I don't know. There's no, as far as I know, no recorded history for this painting in old Chinese books or anything like that. And it's common to attribute paintings, as I've said, with bare trees to Li Cheng, or sometimes Guo Xi, but at any rate, Li Cheng more often. And it may be no more than that. It has bare trees, therefore it's Li Cheng. Well, I admire the painting, as I say, enormously, but I don't put it so early. Now, okay, to conclude with, I want to show a painting which I'll also bring back at the beginning of next lecture, and that is a painting in the Princeton Art Museum, the old collection, Du Bois Schenck Morris collection, published in the old Rowley book. Anyway, and it's a signed work of a late Northern Sung artist named Li Gongnian, not to be confused with Li Gonglin, who was a famous literati painter we'll talk about in the next lecture. Li Gongnian, not so well known, but recorded as having been active in the time of the Emperor Huizong at the very end of the Northern Song. So that gives us a datable landmark. And it's a quite fine painting, as you see, with misty space and bare trees and so on. Now, I myself published this painting fairly early in an exhibition I did of Southern Sung painting. Actually, it could barely be considered Southern Sung, maybe, or late Northern Sung. I included it anyway. And I didn't notice, and nobody else has noticed either, what the subject of the painting really is. It's not just a beautiful landscape that one gazes at. There are people in it and things happening in it. Not happening exactly. Okay, let's go on to the details. Here's a black and white slide of it. And you see how effectively the trees are silhouetted against the dimmer passages behind, and how effectively you move back through this winding valley eventually to the tall peaks looming in the distance. Well, okay, you move visually, but it's not a painting you can move through in the old way at all. Now here in the next slide, here in this detail of the lower part of the picture, in the lower left you can see a boat drawn up and a boatman with his hat on waiting. The boatman has brought somebody out into the landscape, somebody who has come there to view the landscape, to enjoy nature. And that's the real subject of the picture, it turns out. And the boatman is waiting then for this person to finish and come back. Now, next please. In this detail, right in the very center, you can see sort of above the these darker ridge, this darker ridge of rock here, a man seated on the bank, leaning on his left arm, head turned a little bit to the left, but gazing out at the landscape. And is beside him his servant with a staff and so on, waiting patiently as these servants do. Boy servants in these paintings, tungzi are called. So it's the man has come out from the city, presumably, or from wherever, into nature to this scenic place, and has made his way from the boat, from the shore, and is now seated on this bank gazing out over this wonderful landscape. And then here, the upper part of the picture, actually again in the lower, down to the bottom middle, sort of a little left of middle, is a tingzi, one of our, whatever you call them, pavilion something, a place where somebody else may go a bit closer to gaze at the landscape. Now the point again is that what this does to the landscape is to render it landscape meant to be gazed at, peaks meant to be gazed at, not to be explored. There's no way in the world you could climb them or move through the landscape very easily or anything like that. It's this new idea of what you might think of as subjective kind of painting. Well, okay, I'll talk about this more, but I want to just end by speaking a bit more about it. This is the beginnings of what might be called a subjective kind of landscape, as opposed to what could be called objective landscape of the great period of the 10th into or earlier 11th century and on into Guo Xi, say, in which nature is presented as a complete world meant to be explored visually by the viewer as a visual metaphor for moving through the real world and understanding more and more of it. And this kind of landscape, the growth and flourishing of this kind of landscape, coincides, not coincidentally, I think, with early stages of a proto-science, for one thing, which goes through the great development in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. This is the great subject of Joseph Needham. I won't talk much about that. It's another big thing. But it also coincides with a moment in, or movement in Neo-Confucian philosophy. The great philosopher Shao Yung in the 11th century had argued that, I quote Benjamin Ellman here, human beings should not pick out things or phenomena and affairs from a human standpoint. A sage could internalize perception so that the things were perceived as things. In this way, one could exhaustively fathom the principles of all things, Wang Wu Zhi Li. You study things, you understand the world, and you come to this great, comprehensive understanding. Now, a later philosopher, Guo Xi, 1130 to 1200, moved away from this kind of belief, although he continued to see the investigation of things as basic to self-cultivation. He argued that this should be done as a means of cultivating moral principles internally. Things perceived outside should be absorbed and harmonized with human feelings. So we're moving into a period when the school of mind, as it's called, rules Chinese thought, and as I say, is not coincidentally coeval to the same period as this new kind of landscape, in which a way of thought in which the principles of things lie in the mind, not outside of it in the things themselves, and the painting, as I say, somehow corresponds. Well, I'll develop this idea more in the later next lecture. I think it's a very important one. I should say, by the way, that there's a proto-scientist here named Shen Guo of this time was extremely important and related to this problem of Needham, why China started a kind of proto-science but never really developed a truly empirical science and went on to all the things that the West did. Okay, we'll stop there. I've introduced things that I need developing. I'll do more of that in the next lecture.